In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
We have a press which has, seems to me, a relatively wide range of view. There is a pretty small c conservative majority, but there are left-wing papers, there are liberal papers, and there is a pretty large offering of views running from the far right to the far left for those who want them. I don't see how a propaganda model can...
That's not quite true. I mean, there have been good studies of the British press, and you can look at them by James Curran as the major one, which points out that up until the 1960s, there was indeed a kind of a social democratic press which sort of represented much of the interests of working people and ordinary people and so on, and it was very successful. I mean, the Daily Herald, for example, had not only more, it had far higher circulation than other newspapers, but also dedicated circulation. Furthermore, the tabloids at that time, the Mirror and the Sun, were kind of labor-based. By the 60s, that was all gone, and it disappeared under the pressure of capital resources. What was left was overwhelmingly the sort of center to right press with some dissidents. It's true.
I mean, we've got, I would say, a couple of large circulation newspapers which are left of centre, and which are putting in neo-Keynesian views which you'd call the elites are strongly hostile to.
It's interesting that you call neo-Keynesian left of center. I'd just call it straight center. I mean, left of center is a value term, doesn't mean anything.
Sure, you can.
But there are extremely good journalists in England. A number of them, they write very honestly and very good material. A lot of what they write couldn't appear here. On the other hand, if you look at the question overall, I don't think you're going to find a big difference. And the few, there aren't many studies of the British press, but the few that there are have found pretty much the same results, and I think the better journalists will tell you that. In fact, what you have to do is check it out in cases. So let's take, say, what I just mentioned, the Vietnam War. The British press did not have the kind of stake in the Vietnam War that the American press did, because they weren't fighting it. Just check sometime and find out how many times you can find the American war in Vietnam described as a U.S. attack against South Vietnam, beginning clearly with outright aggression in 1961 and escalating to massive aggression in 65. If you can find 0.001% of the coverage saying that, you'll surprise me. Well, and in a free press, 100% of it would have been saying that. Now, that's just a matter of fact. It has nothing to do with left and right.
Let me come up to a more modern war, which was the Gulf War, which, again, looking at the press in Britain and watching television, including some American television, I was very, very well aware of the anti-Gulf War dissidents, the no blood for oil campaigns.
That's not the anti-Gulf. That's not the dissidents.
No blood for oil isn't the dissidents?
Saddam Hussein's attack on Kuwait took place on August 2nd. From August, within a few days, the great fear in Washington was that Saddam Hussein was going to withdraw and leave a puppet government, which would be pretty much what the U.S. had just done in Panama. The U.S. and Britain, therefore, moved very quickly to try to undercut the danger of withdrawal. By late August, negotiation offers were coming from Iraq, calling for a negotiated Iraqi withdrawal. The press wouldn't publish them here. It never published them in England. It did leak, however.
There was a great debate about whether there should have been a negotiated settlement.
No, there was not a debate. There was a debate about whether you should continue with sanctions, which is a different question. Because the fact of the matter is we have good evidence that by mid or late August, the sanctions had already worked. Because these stories were coming from high American officials in the State Department, former American officials like Richard Helm. They couldn't get the mainstream press to cover them, but they did manage to get one journal to cover them, Newsday. That's a suburban journal in Long Island, the purpose obviously being to smoke out the New York Times, because it's the only thing that matters. It came out in Newsday, and this continued, I won't go through the details, but this continued until January 2nd. At that time, the offers that were coming were apparently so meaningful to the State Department that State Department officials were saying that, look, this is negotiable, meaningful, maybe we don't accept everything, but it's certainly a basis for negotiated withdrawal. The press would not cover it. Newsday did. A few other people did. I have a couple of op-eds on it. And to my knowledge, you can check this, the first reference to any of this in England is actually in an article I wrote in The Guardian, which was in early January. You can check and see if there's an earlier reference.
Okay, let's look at one of the other key examples, which you've looked at too, which would appear to go against your idea, which is the Watergate.
Watergate is a perfect example. We've discussed it at length in our book, in fact, and elsewhere. It's a perfect example of the way the press was subordinated to power.
But this, this brought down a president.
Let me give you just a minute. Let's take a look. What happened there, here it's kind of interesting, because you can't do experiments in history, but here history was kind enough to set one up for us. The Watergate exposures happened to take place at exactly the same time as another set of exposures, namely the exposures of COINTELPRO.
Oh, sorry, you have to explain that.
It's interesting that I have to explain it because it's vastly more significant than Watergate. That already makes my point. COINTELPRO was a program of subversion carried out not by a couple of petty crooks, but by the National Political Police, the FBI, under 4 administrations. It began in the late Eisenhower administration, ran up till...
This is aimed at the Socialist Workers' Party of America.
The Socialist Workers' Party was one tiny fragment of it. It began... by the time it got through, I won't run through the whole story, it was aimed at the entire New Left, at the women's movement, at the whole black movement. It was extremely broad. Its actions went as far as political assassination. Now, what's the difference between the two? Very clear. In Watergate, Richard Nixon went after half of U.S. private power, namely the Democratic Party, and power can defend itself. So therefore, that's a scandal. He didn't do anything. Nothing happened. Look, I was on Nixon's enemies list. I didn't even know. Nothing ever happened.
Nonetheless, you wouldn't say it was an insignificant event.
No, it was a case where half of U.S. power defended itself against a person who had obviously stepped out of line. And the fact that the press thought that was important shows that they think powerful people ought to be able to defend themselves. Now, whether there was a question of principle involved happens to be easily checked in this case. One tiny part of the COINTELPRO program was itself far more significant in terms of principle than all of Watergate. And if you look at the whole program, I mean, it's not even a discussion. But you have to ask me what COINTELPRO is. You know what Watergate is. There couldn't be a more dramatic example of the subordination of the educated opinion to power here in England as well as in the United States.
I know you've concentrated on foreign affairs and some of these key areas, things we've been talking about.
A lot about domestic policy.
But, well, I'd like to come on to that, because it still seems to me that on a range of pretty important issues for the establishment, there is serious dissent.
That's right.
Gingrich and his neo-conservative agenda in America has been pretty savagely lampooned. The apparently fixed succession for the Republican candidacy at the presidential election has come apart. Clinton, who is a powerful figure, is having great difficulty with Whitewater. Everywhere one looks, one sees disjunctures, openings.
Within a spectrum so narrow that you really have to look hard to find it.
Well, can I just stop you there? Because you say the spectrum is narrow, but on the one hand,
we've
got flat tax Republicans right the way through to relatively big state Democrats.
Find one. Find a big state Democrat. The position now is exactly what Clinton said. The era of big government is over. Big government has failed. The war on poverty has failed. We have to get rid of this entitlement business. That was Clinton's campaign message in 1992. That's the Democrats. What you have now is a difference between sort of moderate Republicans and extreme Republicans. Actually, it's well known that there's been a long-standing sort of split in the American business community. It's not precise, but it's sort of general, between high-tech, capital-intensive, internationally oriented business, which tends to be what's called liberal, and lower-tech, more nationally oriented, more labor-intensive industry, which is what's called conservative. Now, between those sectors, there have been differences. And in fact,